So when we talked about the impressions we form about other people, we talked about it in a context of you meeting one individual and then judging that individual, or me meeting another person, right? Me meeting you. What will be the first things that go to my mind? How will I evaluate whether you're a warm person and a competent person, a trustworthy person and an intelligent person, right? So we're kind of thinking a little bit along those lines. But then in the model that Cuddy and Fisk and Click suggest for social evaluation, what they say is like, okay, the really interesting bit is also that we can use that to organize how stereotypes work. We come back to this in a bigger scheme when we talk about racism, when we talk about prejudice, but let me kind of introduce that a little bit here. And think about it, okay? So it's not just your individual baby-facedness, attractiveness, etc., your features, but it's also your group membership, right? So you can do the same thing that people do with what we did with Howard Shipman, right? You can say to do the same thing where it's like, here's a person, what do you think it is? Here's a group. What do you think they are? Are they trustworthy? Are they, and use these words to organize them, right? And this is what Fisk and Cuddy did. They looked at tons of studies and it's like, okay, from these studies, what can we interfere? What can we learn? How Americans see the people within their society, right? And so you can see this is like about Americans, but you can similar principles, yet different stereotypes might apply for our culture, right? And so you can see on the x-axis the competence and on the y-axis the warmth dimension, right? And you can basically now see each group here arranged, okay? So let's start like, okay, whom do Americans, white, mostly predominantly white Americans like the most, okay? Housewives, Christians, Irish, middle class, Americans, black professionals. Okay, so these are the people where they think like they're both competent and warm. Okay, so there are people whom they judge as most desirable, right? And so this is like where it's kind of, and we come back to this, this also then guides my emotional reactions towards them. And that makes this model from Click and Cuddy and Fisk so interesting because it helps us to understand our emotional reactions and our actions towards them. Okay, so if we go to the left here, high warmth, low competence, right? We see the elderly, the retarded, and the disabled. Whenever I talk about this section here, I have to think about one of Margaret Atwood's book where the protagonist is this old woman and she writes about how infuriating is that nobody around her ever believes her that she could also do something malicious and evil. She's neither malicious nor evil. She's just annoyed that no one believes she has the competence to kind of do something malicious or evil. But this is how we see old people. We see them as somewhat incompetent yet warm, right? And we group them with the retarded or the disabled. Not, I think it's fair to say that these are not the words we would choose today anymore, but this is like these traditional studies. And this is also, you can see if you kind of stretch the interpretation a little bit too far, a little bit too risky, but you can say, okay, this is what do we do with the elderly, retarded, and the disabled? We put them in homes and keep them safe, right? Because they are incapable of taking care of themselves, but we like them, so let's put them in a protected home, right? Then you can see the other, where it's like, okay, what happens if you're really high in competence and low in warmth, right? And we talk about in a second why people have these, but this is like, okay, the rich, the Asians, the Jews, the British, the whites, right? So they think, okay, they seem to be very highly competent, but not very likable, not very trustworthy, not very morally sound, right? You can immediately think about this kind of stereotype about the bad rich person, right? Rich people can't be good people. I have colleagues of mine telling me that, oh, he can't be trusted. It's like, why can't you trust him? Because he's rich. Okay, when, for instance, Bill Gates does something and donates billions to help, for instance, lessen the impact of malaria on children in Africa, people say, but you still can't trust him. He's rich, okay? And so you can see basically that this guides the behaviors or the impressions we have. And then you have the kind of low competence, low warmth. You see here, this is America. You see feminists, Turks, Arabs, welfare recipients, and poor blacks, right? So white Americans think like, oh, these people, they're in a position where they are because they're incompetent and they're also not trustworthy. So in contrast to the elderly, which were incompetent yet likable, this is also somebody we do not want to help. You can also say, I think, and this is like for Susan Fisk has really started research in that area here. It's like the homeless. They're almost like dehumanized, right? They're not part of this kind of category. They're so low on both of them. And that's also our reaction to them, right? It seems unthinkable to me that if somebody on the street comes to me that is not a homeless person, ask me for help, that I will not help them. But if a homeless person ask us for help, ask for money and so forth, it's easy for us, especially if we live in big cities, to just walk by and don't do anything. Okay. So here I kind of hinted at it already. The power of this model is that it kind of helps us to see that if we put people in these groups, perceive them as members of their groups, we already have these emotional reactions, right? Housewife is Christian and Irish people. It's like a curious combination, I would think. It's just like we admire them, or like white Americans admire them. We pity the elderly and the disabled. We envy the rich and we contempt the feminists, right? That's kind of like here if you look at that, right? And it helps us to understand how stereotypes kind of help us to socially evaluate another person and then guide our subsequent actions. So it's not just a person, but we can also use that to classify groups of people. So let me say a little bit about like two of these, like why do I think of a person as warm? And here what Fisk and Cuddy and Click suggests is that basically warmth is driven by competition. If you do not compete with me, for instance, if you're a housewife or elderly or disabled, I'm perfectly fine. There's no competition. I'm happy to ascribe you that I trust you, because there's nothing you can basically take away from me. But if you are, for instance, an immigrant from Asia and competing for my kind of highly educated jobs, right? Now I think like, oh, okay. They're really good. I have to admit, they're really competent, but I don't trust them. You shouldn't trust them. Don't hire them. Hire me. So the moment we have competition, right? The moment we perceive them as less warm, right? So warmth is dominated by competition. Competence is often dominated by status, right? Where it's like, okay, if you're perceived to be of high status, then you're also perceived to be competent. So if you kind of equip yourself with signals of status, you're perceived to be as more competent. We talked a little bit in the office hour about this, right? If you can signal basically with clothing that you're a highly competent person, then you can do that to impact your assessment, but you might also have a expensive watch or the right handbag or whatnot to signal status, and this will positively influence your competence judgments, right? So competence and status go along. Here you can see, and this is the last slide, I think, on this. This is from the one of the two articles I strongly recommend that you read this week, where you kind of say, okay, shared dimensions of social evaluation, right? And it's like agency and competence are kind of, what are they correlated to, right? So what makes somebody to be perceived to be as a competent person? Power, status, prestige, class, skill, influence, effectiveness, right? And so on, what are you kind of with for communion and warmth, right? This is like same synonyms for this, right? If you're friendly, if you're higher in morality, these are these two facets, right? And then you have kind of like, okay, if they're benevolence, trustworthiness, cooperativeness, belief compatibility, right? So one of the models of social evaluation kind of says like, okay, whom do I perceive to be as warm if they share the same beliefs that I have, right? So different emphasis, resource sharing, and equality. Okay, so you can see that on the one hand, status, power, prestige dominate competence, and then kind of like a lack of competition, of cooperation, of trustworthiness dominates the warmth dimension. All right. And this is the last bit that I wanted to put in the lecture. And there are 2 more videos to come. Apply this to 2 specific cases.